Soulful leadership, sacred rebellion in a world that's lost its way. All leadership is contextual. So, what do I mean by that? That, when we're leading, we're responding to the needs of the moment, of the context, of the environment that we're in. And soulful leadership, we're going to inquire initially into the two primary contexts of existence, self and world. So we're going to look broadly at the context that we're in, the outside context of the world, what's happening there, and the internal context of the self, what's happening there, what does it mean to be human? Um, and we're asking, what does it mean to be human on this earth at this time? Yeah. So this is a little overview of what's coming up in this presentation: the world, the polycrisis, the Anthropocene, neoliberalism, the meta crisis of meaning and belonging, the self, dimensions of being, the survival personality, and the soul. Crisis awakening, the relationship between crisis and awakening, the stages of awakening, and the kind of psychological things that emerge in that. I'm going to be offering some psychological models. And then soulful leadership. How is soulful leadership a response to these things? Looking at the psychological needs created in times of crisis and the qualities of soulful leadership as I've articulated them, and then a little bit about some more of my offerings coming up. So, what is the nature of this moment? This is one way of thinking about the nature of this moment. Which is a cascade of crises that are embedded in each other. And yeah, as you can see, this visual was created at the time when COVID was a thing. And it really just demonstrates how there's an interlinked crises here. And we're dealing often with the thing that's most present, but behind them are, yeah, like climate change and biodiversity collapse, ecological collapse are realities that are, although they're not currently perhaps affecting us, um, you know, in the north, they are affecting lots of people in the global south, and these are realities that we're facing. So this is another just like way of thinking about the polycrisis, which is the idea that there are multiple interlinked crises. So there's all of these different risks that we're facing. And this is, of course, not comprehensive, but it just goes to show how there's different types of risk, there's different or crisis, and they're all related to each other. And this is part of the difficulty that we're facing as a global society. So many people obviously call this time, this moment that we're in, the Anthropocene. And yeah, what does that mean? It's a time when humans are having a major effect on the globe. Um, there has been kind of civilizational collapse many times in history, but what we haven't yet been in the position of is that we're affecting the biosphere, we're affecting the whole globe. So the stakes are higher than they've ever been. Um, now, like no aspect of the world has really been untouched. There's the kind of water polluted all over the world. There's microplastics in the tap water. And we can think of this as a time when culture is kind of overtaking nature. We're not in harmony. Of course, there's so much to say about this. I'm just kind of touching on things briefly, just to give us paint a little bit of a picture as to the kind of state of play that we're in. And I quite like this because it's a bit of a surreal, like absurd illustration of neoliberalism, which is the ideology of the Anthropocene. And neoliberalism is a kind of capitalism that's very pro-corporate and extraction based. And so the the thing is with the poly crisis is that there's so many interlinked issues that we can't really isolate anything, and we're all inevitably entwined now in neoliberalism, right? Whether or not we're ideologically aligned with it, we we exist within it, and we have to kind of play the game. Um, and part of that game is debt-based capital. So debt-based capital is the structure of our economy, and what it means is that money is printed at debt of 1%, and then it's lent at debt of 2%, and then the global economy has to grow to 3% in order for that money to be valuable. And what that means is that the global economy has to double um, every 20 years. And so obviously, because we live in an extraction-based economy, that means that we're extracting natural resources to then create goods and services to then sell them, to then um, double the global economy. And in order for us to not have a collapse, and what that basically, that can't happen again. Economists and ecologists are saying that's not going to happen again. We cannot double the global economy again without creating like collapse, basically, because we've already reached 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, and 200 species are going extinct today, and yeah, we're running out of resources. So um, this is the problem that we're in, is that actually debt-based capital is kind of a Ponzi scheme, and there's nothing underneath it. There's no safety net. Um, and part of the problem as well, of capitalism in general, is that the market actually benefits from certain behaviors. And those behaviors are addictive and compulsive behaviors, right? So anything that can be sold to us can also potentially create addiction and compulsion. And this, I've taken this from Before School, which is a great YouTube channel, and I'll share some links in the follow-up, because this is from one of the videos, which is illustrated little clip of Daniel Schmachtenberger speaking. And Daniel Schmachtenberger is a really great person that articulates very well the complexity of the crises that we're in. And this specific graphic is just going to show that actually it's quite it's easy to monetize, obviously, addictive and compulsive behavior. And so, without kind of saying there's some puppeteer at the top that's kind of, manipulating us all, it's saying no, the system dynamics encourage compulsive and addictive behavior. That's what we're saying, because actually the economy needs to grow. So in a way, the economy itself, or capitalism or neoliberalism itself, is this hungry machine, right? And we're part of that machine. So it kind of creates these behaviors in us. And so, what in a way, like where we then are within this system, is that we're constantly being offered comfort, short-term satisfaction, right? The hit. This is about dopamine spikes, the hit that will make us feel a little bit better, right? Um, and those things can often come at the cost of like worthy struggle that actually then creates meaning, right? Because they offer us an easy way out. There can be a cop out, there can be okay, some kind of sense of relief. So, we're living in a time where people can be obese and die of malnutrition, right? So just take that in for a minute. What does that mean to be obese and die of malnutrition? You're overeating, but you're eating food that has no nutritional value at all. So there's loads of fast food out there that's essentially just toxic. It has no nutritional value at all. And so there's a hollowness, we were picking up on that hollowness in our chat earlier, where it's like something's there, but there's nothing actually of any value in it. But we're stuffing ourselves full of this stuff that has no nutritional value, both literally in terms of like Coca-Cola and Big Macs, like they don't have any physical nutritional value, but also kind of spiritually or soulfully, like in terms of the connection that we might be seeking through social media or through porn, right? These things are big yeah, it's just very prevalent in our culture at the moment. And so there's also a hollowness to those ways of interacting. Like what fast food is to nutrition is what kind of social media is to human relationships, and porn is to actual intimacy. Yeah, there's a hollowness in so much of what is offered to us in the established culture. And it's essentially there's a loss of soul, there's a loss of the root of that meaning of what it means to be deeply human. So, what happens because we're in this system and because the system is largely encouraging compulsive and addictive behaviors is we are increasingly disconnected from that root in our deep humanity. So we could say that the meta crisis is a crisis of disconnection. And many people say this. It's a crisis of disconnection from self, from other, and from the natural world. So we're not connected to ourselves. We don't know who we are. That creates the mental health crisis. We're not connected to each other. We're not connected to our shared humanity, right? So that creates all sorts of violence and social polarization. We're not connected to the natural world. So we're destroying it, and that creates ecological crisis. So disconnection leads to dehumanization and desecration, right? Desecration and desacralization. Things are no longer sacred. And when something is sacred, is not sacred anymore, it can be undermined and it can be destroyed. So this is why the sacred and the soulful is so important. Michael Mead, a big commentator on soul, he talks about the soul as actually the glue that binds everything together. We'll get into that shortly. So yeah, we could say if the meta crisis is a crisis of meaning and belonging, then it's an existential crisis. Existential relates to existence and big questions around meaning and purpose and identity. So there's a crisis of disconnection from self and other and natural world. We don't know who we are and we don't feel that we belong. So it's an existential crisis. And this quote from Gus Speth became quite famous, and it points to something important. I used to think that the top environmental problems were biodiversity loss, ecosystem collapse, and climate change. So they are big problems at one level. I thought that 30 years of good science could address these problems. I was wrong. The top environmental problems are selfishness, greed, and apathy. And to deal with these, we need a cultural and spiritual transformation. We scientists don't know how to do that. So actually, obviously what he's saying is there's major problems at one level in terms of the world that out there, the what's happening. But actually also, what's also true is that those problems are a result of human behaviors and attitudes, selfishness, greed, and apathy. And that the response to those actually needs to be psychospiritual. It's not going to come from scientists. Cultural and spiritual transformation is going to come from a different place. Yeah. So the polycrisis is so complex and so intertwined. It can't be, we can't just isolate anything and solve it, right? We like this problem solution kind of dichotomy, but it's much bigger than that. It's a predicament. And a predicament requires a psycho-spiritual approach because it requires more than analysis and strategy. Even if we're going to be super clever about working out what the problems are, it's not there is no solution that can come from the mind. Yeah. So that's some of what's out there in terms of the context of the world and some of the issues that we're facing as shared humanity at this time. So looking now in the context of self and what does it mean to be human? And I'm going to draw upon some models from psychosynthesis. Um, Bit of a spelling mistake there, but never mind. Um, which is, yeah, it's an integrative, holistic, and depth psychology that takes into account the whole human being, including our spiritual and soulful dimensions. So for me, it provides some really helpful frameworks in terms of answering this question of what it means to be human. And this is the central diagram from psychosynthesis. It's called the egg diagram. And we won't go too deeply into this. We're kind of just offering it as a way of thinking, which is just to say that to be human is to have multiple dimensions of consciousness. And, um, you know, psychosynthesis emerged kind of as a response to psychoanalysis. Chrissy, you were mentioning psychoanalysis earlier. um, where Roberto Assagioli, who was the founder of psychosynthesis, was a student of Sigmund Freud, who was the creator of psychoanalysis. And he said, yeah, this is all true and great, but Freud's missing the higher dimensions of consciousness, our creative and intuitive potential. And Assagioli wanted to create a model which also included that. So psychoanalysis focuses more on the lower unconscious, so fear, shame, and trauma. And yeah, transpersonal psychologies, including psychosynthesis, also include the higher unconscious, which is about accessing our potential, our creativity, and our intuition. So there are personal and transpersonal dimensions to our experience. And a lot of psychology focuses on the personal and the formation of the identity. And if we look at all the, our wounding and our childhood and how that created how we are in the world. And it's really important to understand our personal psychology. It's really helpful. And from the psychospiritual perspective, there's also more. There's also a dimension to our being which is beyond the personal. That's what trans means, beyond. And that's what we might call the soul. So the soul is a part of our identity that's beyond our personality. Yeah. And the soul actually has different motivations from the personality. So the survival personality is created in response to the world. And often it is seeking things like control and approval and security in order to create safety, in order to survive. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's important. We also need that. And there's another part of our being that wants to emerge and that has a different motivation and a different orientation. And I frame the soul's appetites as truth, beauty, freedom, and love. These are the appetites of the soul. And I'm sure all of you have had experiences where the pursuit of truth or beauty or freedom and love has actually been more important than maintaining your personal security, right? Like that love affair that was going to get you into trouble, right? That was made you take a risk, that where you risked humiliation or you risked destabilization because actually it was more important to follow that love or to follow that truth, right? So many of us have had experiences of this in some small way. And that is a flavor of what the soul is calling us into. So, yeah, as I was saying, the survival personality is an intricate weaving of defense mechanisms and survival strategies. It develops in response to our environment in early life, in our efforts to get our needs met. It's not bad, but it becomes irrelevant and limiting as it outlives the context it developed in and instead becomes a lens through which we see the world. So, often what's happening when someone is in a moment of existential crisis is that the deeper self or soul is wanting to emerge and it's imprisoned in the survival personality. So it's like you're outgrowing your survival personality, and that's when you start to question, who am I? And it feels like, oh, my identity doesn't fit me anymore, right? So if we've just followed our survival needs our whole life, then yeah, we might come to a time where we're really questioning what's the point? And we'll get more deeply into that shortly. So the purpose of the false self or survival personality is not adaptive but defensive. It protects against painful feelings. In other words, the false self does not set out to master reality, but to avoid painful feelings, a goal it achieves at the cost of mastering reality. So that's just to say, you know, yeah, the survival personality is trying to protect us from pain. And in some ways, that's helpful. And in other ways, it's not, because we actually need to kind of endure a certain amount of healthy challenge in order to grow, yeah, at a deeper level of our being. Um, and that's if you remember the image from earlier where there was a crossroads and there's like the comfort of like all of the short-term kind of satisfactions versus the challenge of perhaps the road into the wilderness. And in a way that really represents like the choice psychologically in each moment. Do we fall back into like some sense of like self-soothing and comforting? Or are we like intrepid in terms of meeting our edges and kind of embracing a deeper conversation with life? Like, do we want to try and avoid pain all the time, or are we willing to learn to grow in strength to endure pain? So this is kind of, yeah, one way you could look at the differences in survival personality and the soul. So the survival personality is motivated to survive, driven by fear. It has a will to protect. It needs validation. It's defensive and reactive, and it's rigid and rooted in history. It's socialized and conformist. We'll get more into that. And it's hungry for control and approval and security. Whereas the soul is motivated to experience, wants to experience, doesn't want to protect us from experience. It's moved by desire, has a will to connect. It needs to express. It's response able, as in able to respond, to sense and respond. It's ever emerging and evolving, not rigid and fixed, but constantly moving. It's synergistic and authentic, and it's hungry for truth, beauty, freedom, and love. So, like I've been saying, our survival personalities, in their efforts to protect us, actually hold us captive. And taking this back now to like the global stage, we could say that the crisis that we're facing, this crisis of disconnection, reflects the ego's story of separation. Yeah. And the desire for control and approval and security. So we're talking about self and world in a way was like separating them, but of course they're not separate. It's impossible to separate them because the world is a product of the self, and then the world also informs the self, and then the self informs the world, and they're completely intertwined. And so if the psychological reality is we believe that we're separate, then we're going to also create conditions of disconnection, and conditions of disconnection are going to also aggravate the sense of separation. The soul wants to be free. That doesn't want to be held captive by the survival personality. It wants, to connect and express and all of those things that were just on the list. So let's talk a little bit about what is soul, just briefly. There's so much to say, but just to say a few words. Um, this is one way that I frame it, because people talk about like the immortal soul, in religiously, um, and some people have been put off that word soul because of its use in religious text. But spiritually, in terms of kind of like, yeah, or theologically, the soul is the part of us that doesn't die. So the body dies. And then the idea of the soul is that there is another part of us that endures the deaths of multiple bodies, right? Which is in like, the idea of reincarnation. So spiritually, the soul is the part of us that is immortal. Now, you might not be into that, but there's other ways that we can look at it. Psychologically, the soul is essential. So then when people started becoming interested in the soul and using the language of the soul in psychology, people like James Hillman, people like Jean Houston, and then people like also, yeah, Michael Mead and David White and all of this, they're talking about the essential self. Yeah. So that's also kind of partly how I've been referring to it, as in not the false self, the survival personality, not the shell, but the deeper root of our humanity. Yeah. The essential self. And then another framing is that the soul is like our erotic self, which means the part of us that is in connection to the web of life. Yeah. And this is Bill Plotkin, who's one of the major commentators on soul. He says that your soul is your ecological niche. So it's and that's related to being your essential self, because it's if you're your essential self, you're inhabiting the part of the ecology that only you can inhabit, and that it is the place where you can be most connected. So yeah, here's the quote from Bill Plotkin. Soul is primarily an ecological concept. Your soul is your unique ecological niche. Ecological in the sense of understanding each part plays a specific role in the whole. And like I was saying earlier, Michael Mead says, our soul is the place where we connect to the soul of the world as well. So if we're inhabiting our essential self, the kind of root of our humanity, we're also plugged into the wider ecology of life. And therefore, we're fulfilling our ecological niche. So when we don't do that, when we don't fulfill our ecological niche, and when we conform within systems of oppression that deny the sacredness of life, we create crisis. And we could say one way that we could think about the crisis of leadership is a crisis of conformity and a crisis of morality. So we were thinking earlier about the state of leadership, and there was a sense of hollowness and fakeness and superficiality, and not a sense that the people that we see inhabiting positions of leadership are inhabiting their deep humanity, right? That they're disconnected actually from what it means to be human and from what kind of matters at a deeper level. And so what's going on when so many other people are conforming to systems of oppression and disconnection? Yeah. When we conform within these systems, we're actually also facing a crisis of morality, because we are colluding in those behaviors, and we're not inhabiting our deep humanity and the moral imperative that is at the core of being human, which is about caring for others, right? So when we think about those soulful leaders and we think about how they stood for something beyond themselves, or someone was saying, they care for others. That's the moral imperative that we each have as humans, to be in right relationship to each other in the world. So morality in this sense is about that internal tuning of right relationship of, is this right? Is this causing harm? And of course, if we're kind of engaged in compulsive and addictive behaviors, then we're maybe being too short-term and self-interested to actually consider the implications of our behaviors in terms of the wider web of relationality. So we all end up colluding in the systems that create the crises that we're in. And you may have heard this quote, but it's really relevant to this inquiry. It's no measure of good health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. So, yeah, we've been kind of obviously sold an idea that, like, yeah, sanity is just like conforming within this system. But when the system is actually like suicidal and destroying the world, then it's not sane. It's not sane to conform within that system. And actually, the more sane thing is to remember who we truly are as humans, and to root in that reality, and then to act with care, right? This is an infographic from I Want a Better Catastrophe by Andrew Boyd. And he's basically saying, yeah, well, that we're there. And that we can't face, like, the options aren't looking good, basically. So we can't kind of like just get over this unscathed. Something's going to happen. We're going to have some kind of collapse. And so when he's saying, I want a better catastrophe, he's saying, how do we actually look at, really like look at what's happening and respond rather than kind of like ignorantly just like falling into extinction. And along those lines, there's no safety in conforming within a suicide or culture. And what Andrew Boyd would say is we have no non-radical futures left. Yeah, so that's a lot. But there's hope because there's a relationship between crisis and awakening. And as this quote says, the transpersonal works very deliberately with failure and crisis as opportunities for creative breakthrough. So we are facing crisis, but in the psych-spiritual perspective, there's an awareness that a crisis is a catalyst for emergence, that there's a relationship between emergence and emergency, between breakdown and breakthrough. And so it's helpful to have this context from psychosynthesis about the stages of awakening when we're thinking about crisis, because crisis and awakening can look like crisis. So we'll just quickly go through this. The crisis preceding awakening, life lacks meaning. The crisis of awakening, things will never be the same again. Reactions to awakening, inflation and mystic flight, or denial and oppression. This is really important. And then integration. So psychologically, when we're facing crisis or awakening, which are kind of the same things, there's different things that emerge in life. So when life is lacking meaning in this stage, these are some of the things we might be experiencing: aridity, boredom, depression, self-doubt. In a crisis of awakening, where we recognize, oh, maybe there's a bigger picture here, we might experience bliss and transcendence, or we might experience overwhelm and terror. And so this is relevant as well in terms of awakening. When we're saying awakening, well, it doesn't necessarily mean like awakening to the bliss of reality. Is like, yes, and awakening to the crises of our times, right? Awakening, becoming more awake, becoming more aware is also really challenging and might lead to overwhelm and extreme emotion and terror. Now, we might have a reaction to those feelings because those are big feelings. And so psychologically, we might try and protect against those big feelings through some of these, kind of psychological defenses, which are inflation, idealism, fanaticism, splitting, mystic flight. And then what's needed and the labor in a way that we need to do psychologically is this kind of integration process, which might look like the frustration of like, oh, the potential of how the world could be and how it is, and being willing to just like be in that and come down to earth rather than flying away in idealization. Oh yeah, at a personal level, resolving stuff from our past so we're not projecting out onto the world, and humility, etc. So this explains like two of the different crises that we can experience at an individual level. And it's saying that generally people might go through a process of self-actualization, which is more about kind of engaging with materiality, and then come to a time where life lacks meaning. So this is the crisis preceding awakening, and they'll have a crisis of meaning, and they'll be like, what's it all for? Other people might go on more of a spiritual journey and have various transcendent experiences, which might actually make it difficult for them to reconcile themselves with the world. And we'd call that a crisis of duality. And it means that then they find it hard to find their feet and to actually create a meaningful life. Because this is where you get more stuck in idealization or fanaticism or mystic flight. So, crisis of meaning experienced by actualizers when they reach a point of personal doubt or spiritual aridity in their previously driven, unquestioned, or confident lives. Yeah. So people that have definitely like maybe gone for the status quo and then like realized, oh, actually, maybe there's something more. Crisis of duality experienced by transcenders when they return from spiritual exploration or experiences of self-realization to find the real world too painful or difficult to deal with. So both of these are very prevalent. And what we're interested in is how do we like hold the line of like having our feet on the ground in the world, and also like reaching towards potential and intuition and creativity. And we might call that standing in the tragic gap. So this is a term from Parker Palmer, and he says what happens is that the world is so painful, is really hard for us to reconcile ourselves with it. And so what happens is that we flip out on one side or other of the tragic gap. And he says on one side there's corrosive cynicism, and on the other side there's irrelevant idealism. So you can see how potentially corrosive cynicism might be related to a crisis of meaning. If somebody is like not willing to consider that there might be more to life, that means they're cynical. They'll often undermine or deride kind of like spiritual exploration or questions of greater meaning and purpose. And you can see how idealism might be related to a crisis of duality, where someone's like maybe kind of like always like just hoping for the best and being really optimistic, or like being stuck in kind of like, oh, it's all happening at this level and it's all happening like kind of magical thinking, and not necessarily engaging with yeah, other challenges. So both of them are defenses. Both of them are defenses against holding the kind of excruciating reality of like, oh, the world is like really in crisis, and also like there's the possibility of awakening, and humans are more, we have these creative intuitive capacities. Um, and so psychologically, this is some of the terrain that we find ourselves in. And I'm not going to go too deeply into it because I'm aware of time, but when we think about what does it mean to lead from that place of soul, yeah, in the crossroads, right? To go on the adventure, to be an intrepid explorer, to have a deeper conversation with life, versus staying stuck in our survival personality, turning away from our potential, turning away from the call of the self, just rather choosing short-term comforts. This is a really helpful model from psychosynthesis. And it's basically saying there's two levels of shame and guilt. One is neurotic, which means it's related to the personality, and one is existential, which means it's related to the soul. And the arbiter of our neurotic guilt and shame is the superego. And the superego is kind of like what we've been told we should do from society, from parental figures. And so if this is where the kind of rebellion thing is really important. Why we're colluding often in things that we actually don't want to do or that we don't feel good, um, because of the superego, because at some level we've been told we should do that. Oh, sorry. So, um, so yeah, I might just conform with something because I feel like I've been told that's what I should do. So like I've been told that I should get a job and buy a flat and have a family, and that's what it means to be a good person, right? Um, and so I might just conform with that. But At an existential level, I might be kind of like, no, I'm doing all of these things and there's something else. There's a deeper call, there's something else that I'm ignoring. And if I don't listen to that, then it creates a different kind of guilt and shame, right? If I don't express my true nature, if I don't express my queerness, if I don't express my like deep feelings, my artistry, if I ignore those things because I'm too busy just trying to get approval and security within the system, then another part of me is actually calling out. Yeah. And that's the existential guilt and shame. So, coming to the end, I know it's been long now. Um, Soulful leadership is essentially a response to all of this. It's saying, okay, we're facing these crises, and actually, because the crisis is ultimately existential, we need a psychospiritual response. Yeah. So it's bringing all of this thinking together and saying the world is increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That's what VUCA stands for. And that VUCA, conditions created by crisis, create certain psychological needs. And then there are certain soulful responses that can actually help. So the volatility in the world creates reactivity and kind of compulsion and addiction, like we were talking about. Actually, the psychological need there is regulation and disidentification. And the transpersonal response is developing inner ground and presence, right? So yes, we need to learn to regulate and disidentify and come back to our center. And that's like from the level of just like standard psychology. And at the transpersonal level, we can go beyond that and create a deep ground of being. And that creates the soulful quality of responsibility, right? Versus reactivity. Yeah. So if I've got a deep ground of being, I can actually respond rather than react because I'm steady in myself, even if the outside conditions are chaotic and volatile. Um, Uncertainty can create cynicism when we don't know what's going to happen. There's a psychological defense of like just pushing away possibility, which is what I think cynicism is about. So psychological need there is actually tolerance of uncertainty. And how do we learn to be tolerant of uncertainty? We don't know what's going to happen. We have to trust in life's unfolding. And I think that, yeah, devotion to something beyond us really helps with that. So devotion versus a nihilism, well, it doesn't matter anyway. I don't know what's going to happen, doesn't matter. It's all chaos. So there's a lot more to all of these, but yeah, this is some of my thinking around how soulful leadership is a response to the needs of the time. So complexity can create a desire to conform. It's so complex, I don't know what to do, right? And so then we just conform to the status quo. I've been told what to do. Like I don't have to think, I don't want to have to think about it for myself. It's too complex, it's overwhelming. So I'll just conform. The psychological need is actually is secure self-attachment. Yeah, there's lots of complexity out there, and I know who I am. I know who I am. So it's okay. Because my authentic self is the way that I inhabit the complexity. That's the soulful thing, right? Of like the ecological niche is like, yeah, the world's super complex, but also that doesn't need to overwhelm me because I've got this ground of being and I know who I am. Yeah. And then ambiguity, I think, can create more resignation. So the world is so ambiguous, like, you know, we don't really know what's true or not anymore. There's loads of fake news. There's no one's speaking clear signal. There's so many like different opinions being thrown out and different facts and different ways of looking. And yeah, it's hard to find the signal within the noise. And that can create a kind of moral resignation. Again, we don't want to have to navigate the complexity of it, of that ambiguity. So we need to learn to hold paradox. And the transpersonal responses around standing in the tragic gap, like we were just looking at, basically being willing and able to hold the tension of the times and to hold the tension of not knowing. And to still, because you know who you are and you're grounded in your being, have the moral courage to act rather than kind of choosing cowardice. So if we are able to embody these soulful qualities, we might be like this. Warriors of the spirit are awake human beings who have chosen not to flee, they abide. They serve as beacons of an ancient story that tells of the goodness and generosity and creativity of humanity. You will know them by their compassionate presence. You can identify them by their cheerfulness. When asked how they do it, they will tell you about discipline, dedication, and the necessity of community. So that's, in a way, a great description of a soulful leader, a warrior of the spirit. And the way that I think about soulful leadership is that it's about heartfulness, so the courage to face the world, to stand in the tragic gap, and to lead from meaning in service to a higher ideal. And I call that moral courage. Truthfulness, right? So being vulnerable, being authentic, being open, and expressing with authenticity. Attunement, so intuition and embodied sensitivity, being able to respond appropriately to the need at the time. Responsibility. And humility and reverence for life, which is devotion. So these are the qualities of soulful leadership that I kind of put on my compass there. And their responses to these reactions to the crises of our times, which are nihilism and narcissism and numbness and conformity and cynicism and cowardice, right? So we've just looked at how the crises create these psychological needs and how soulful leadership then responds to them. So it's easy to, in the face of the pain of the world, turn away, to collapse into nihilism or narcissism or numbness or conformity. And actually what we need is to develop these qualities so that we can respond. And also you could look at this compass as like answers to the questions. Yeah, who am I? Who are we? Where are we? And what is there to do? Which are the questions that we need to ask if we want to lead or just navigate these times with grace. So just briefly, I'll say a little bit about the coaching container that's coming up in a couple of weeks, where we'll go way more deeply into all of this. We've really just been touching briefly on everything this evening. The program is about developing these qualities, basically, so that we can navigate these times with authenticity and heart. I won't read through all of this, but just, yeah, give you a little sense of what's involved. It's over 6 weeks. There's, a 2.5 hour workshop every week. And then within that, you get 3 one-to-one sessions. So you really get to then apply the learning to yourself and to your life. And you get recordings as well and exercises. So there's lots in there where we're really kind of taking all of this into your life and working out what it means to you and how you might want to apply it to creating change. Da, da, da. And this is some of what people have said about the course. Okay, that's it. I'm going to